Good evening. My name is John Hurd. I'm Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of our Fall 2020 Social Science Matters webinars, Politics During the Pandemic, Insights from the UMass Poll. No one needs reminding that we're all living in perilous times of the global pandemic, an economic crisis that exacerbates existing inequalities, and considerable political uncertainties involving a federal government that, let's just say, doesn't enjoy the full confidence of the American people. The upcoming elections are particularly consequential at both the national and subnational levels, including a number of interesting races right here in Massachusetts. Today, we'll be hearing from two SBS faculty who run the UMass poll, as well as an SBS alum from our journalism department, who will be discussing pressing topics surrounding politics in our current environment. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Lundquist. She's Professor of Sociology and Senior Associate Dean of Research and Faculty Development in SBS. Dr. Lundquist will be moderating our panel today. Jen?
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. And I'll start by introducing our first panelist, who is Tatishe Nteta, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of UMass Poll.
My name is Tatishe Nteta, and I'm an associate professor of political science here at UMass, as well as the director of the UMass poll. I'm joined on the poll by Associate Director Jesse Rhodes, who you'll be hearing from very soon, as well as Professor Ray LaRaja and Professor Alex Theodoridis. Tonight, what I'm going to do is share with you the results from our most recent poll of Massachusetts registered voters, which was in the field in late July and early August. And really, I'm going to focus attention on the Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy III Senate race, the Democratic primary that will be happening now in less than a week. So just a quick background on the UMass poll. We launched in 2010, and since that time, we have fielded about 25 polls. And these polls have looked at key elections, salient political issues, and have provided a really good understanding of citizens' assessments of the state as well as of the nation. And we've polled primarily in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and have done national polls as well. The results from our poll have gotten a lot of media attention, both at the national level and the state level. National coverage from outlets such as MSNBC, Fox News, CNN. Locally, our results have been in the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, and currently our media partner is WCVB in Boston. Our results have also garnered the attention of a number of elected officials, most prominently in 2015, after a Massachusetts poll of the Republican presidential primary. President Donald Trump tweeted out, "Great poll numbers out of UMass Amherst. Thank you. Hashtag Trump 2016. Hashtag Make America Great Again." There is a Trump tweet for everything. All right. So what I want to do is give you a sense of what we were working on this past summer. And in partnership with WCVB in Boston, we fielded an online poll of about 500 Massachusetts registered voters. And of those 500, about 360 were likely Democratic Senate primary voters. Some details in terms of when we fielded it and the margin of error, and I'm more than willing to discuss those in the Q&A. So we looked at a number of topics, approval ratings, perceptions of the economic well-being, both of the state and of the nation, questions about race relations and Black Lives Matter. This is, of course, pressing given the recent news in the NBA that all teams are boycotting tonight. We had a number of questions about the presidential election and concerns about the general election, but what I want to do is really focus attention on the Senate election. And so, as you know, the Senate election pits Representative Joseph Kennedy III against a longtime incumbent, Senator Ed Markey. And we asked a number of questions about this particular race. So we wanted to know what the most important qualities that voters wanted in Senate candidates. We asked voters to describe each candidate in one word. We asked voters which candidate they trust on major issues. And of course, we asked about the preference of the voters for Representative Kennedy or Senator Markey. So what did we find? Surprisingly, at least at that time, we found that Senator Markey was up 15 percentage points over Representative Kennedy. And this again is late July, early August. And this is up from February, and we had asked voters this question in February during Super Tuesday before the campaign really got in full swing. And at that point in time, Senator Markey had a 3 percentage point lead over Representative Kennedy. But that had ballooned, as we saw in August, to about 15 percentage points. So just breaking down in terms of demographics, who supports who, we see across almost all of the demographics that we analyzed, education, race, income, age, that Senator Markey had a distinct advantage over Representative Kennedy. As you can see here, the only areas or the only groups in which Representative Kennedy had a lead over Senator Markey are among respondents or voters who have a high school education or less, and non-white voters. So this, of course, led to a number of questions as to why it is Markey had such a large lead over Kennedy. And so going to the data, one of the first answers to that question is, we think, found in responses to the most important candidate quality. So we asked voters to rank the most important candidate quality that they're looking for in a Democratic senator. And as you can see here from our results, the central quality that voters are looking for is congruence between the candidate and the voter on key issues, right? So 27% of our respondents identified the candidate that best represents their views on issues as their top or most important candidate quality. And you can go down the line and see how voters sort of assessed other qualities. We also asked the same set of voters, which candidate do you trust to handle each of the following issues? And again, we can see across a range of issues which are pertinent in the Commonwealth, Senator Markey outdistances Representative Kennedy. On COVID-19, on transportation, on dealing with President Trump, on taxes, on healthcare, on economy, on climate change, again, Senator Markey has a distinct advantage. The only area in which Representative Kennedy beats Senator Markey is on race relations. And of course, this is sort of connected to the campaign, which is really focused on issues of racial equity, equality, and the Black Lives Matter movement. So a second reason we think is found in the ways in which voters see both of these candidates. So we asked voters to describe each candidate in one word. And what we're going to see is that voters have a more favorable view of Markey relative to Kennedy. So here's a word cloud, and what the word cloud does is provide you with the entirety of all of the words that are used, but the words that are largest are the ones that are most frequently used to describe the candidate in question. And this is the word cloud for Senator Markey. We can see words like experience, progressive, good, liberal, reliable, hardworking emerge as very positive descriptions of the candidate. There are negatives here, but as we're going to see relative to Representative Kennedy, there are not as many negative words used to describe Senator Markey. So here's a word cloud for Representative Kennedy. So you can see from this words like opportunist, ambitious, entitled, young, and in this case, young may not be a positive. Kennedy, right? And in some ways that again might not be a positive as it pertains to Representative Kennedy. And then finally, we think the answer to the question as to why Markey has a distinct lead is found in the approval ratings. If you look at approval ratings for Senator Markey, they are relatively high, as I'm going to show in a second. And in primaries, incumbents who have low approval ratings are prone to the throw the bums out type of treatment by the voters. But what we found when we looked at approval ratings, not just in August, but also in February, is that Senator Markey enjoys widespread approval from likely Democratic voters. So in February, 69% of likely Democratic voters approved of the job that Senator Markey is doing for the state. And that number jumped to 72% in August. So for these three reasons, we think that Senator Markey at this moment in time, again, 6 days out from the election, doesn't enjoy an advantage. But I think in 6 days, we're going to find out which side wins, right? Does the Kennedy name brand in statewide politics and an overarching desire for change that we see across the country, is that going to be enough to overthrow a relatively popular incumbent with 47 years of experience? Thanks so much, and I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion.
Okay, and next I will introduce Stephanie Murray, who is an alumna of the journalism department from 2018, and she is the Politico Massachusetts Playbook author.
So I was just saying thank you so much to everyone who's joining us this evening. As a proud graduate of UMass Amherst, this is extra special for me to be here tonight. I'm the author of the Politico Massachusetts Playbook, which is a daily email newsletter about Massachusetts politics, and I'm the co-host of the Horse Race podcast, something I do through Mass Inc. And to begin, I'd just like to talk about a few things that I've been focusing on with my work lately. And I think the common thread through all of it is just how tumultuous the 2020 election cycle has been and will continue to be. You know, after a crowded and oftentimes very dramatic, intense presidential primary process, we have President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, who will face off in November in what feels like a pivotal election to pretty much everyone I speak to. I think as we get started, it's important to note the top priorities of Massachusetts voters, and this is according to the UMass poll. Those are the coronavirus, the pandemic, unemployment, jobs in the economy, housing, healthcare. So these are all issues that are all colliding at once because of the coronavirus pandemic. But if the primary showed us anything, the common thread is that all voters are focused on Trump. His base is focused on keeping him in office, and Democrats are united in defeating him. The political environment is also really chaotic right now in Massachusetts, in the Senate race, but also beyond. Even a few years ago, running in a primary against an incumbent, especially a pretty well-liked one, would have been a total challenge of the political norm, even though after the past couple of election cycles, it seems normal now. This trend of primary challengers toppling incumbents, I think perhaps is most associated with New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley here in Massachusetts. And the trend is continuing, especially among progressive Democrats. I'm thinking about Jamal Bowman, who just unseated longtime Congressman Eliot Engel of New York. I'm thinking about Cori Bush in Missouri, and then a whole host of other progressive primary challengers who came quite close to doing that. And we have a few races like that here in Massachusetts. But the race that's on everybody's mind is the Senate primary between Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Joe Kennedy. It's grown intensely negative and personal in the days leading up to the primary. I think I saw a figure that over $20 million, the candidates themselves have already spent over $20 million, and that's not counting the super PACs and outside groups. I'm sure everybody knows this. If you turn on the TV or if you have in the past month, it's like they're buying ad space in your brain right now. What's really interesting to me about the Senate race, and the poll hit on a lot of these data points, is that the race sort of defies political wisdom, in that both candidates are working to cast themselves as sort of the insurgent underdog. But with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi backing Congressman Kennedy and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer backing Markey, it's just as easy to cast them both as insiders. So that dynamic of a more liberal, more to the left, progressive primary challenger running against a longtime, more moderate Democrat. It's happening in other congressional districts, but that's not really the case in this Senate race. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to watch and also difficult to fit into any sort of narrative. A few interesting points that I'll highlight from the poll now, and I hope that we can talk about in more detail in a little bit, are just the way that Markey has been kind of able to seize on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and reintroduce himself to voters. And he's done that through the Green New Deal, which he partnered with AOC, endorsements from the Sunrise Movement and others. And he's been able to do that because his name ID and his favorability were relatively low last year. And that's why part of the reason why Congressman Kennedy decided to run in the first place, and Markey had a few other progressive, a few other primary challengers who have since dropped out. But what Markey was able to do, because he wasn't as well known as, he was sort of in the shadow of Senator Elizabeth Warren and other better known Democrats in Massachusetts, he was able to reshape himself in the way that he wanted voters to see him now. when this race began, Kennedy supporters would tell me that they expected Markey to drop out and retire to avoid the embarrassment of losing a primary after 40 years in Congress. And now it is a tight race. He pretty much did the opposite, and polling shows him ahead. So that's something that none of us could have predicted last year, but it's been really interesting to watch. I'm also paying close attention to the House races across the state. One, for example, is Holyoke Mayor Alex Morse, who's challenging House Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal. And that's a challenge from the left, just as Democrats are involved and lots of outside money being spent there. And Congressman Stephen Lynch faces a similar primary challenge, although there's a little bit less money and a little bit less attention on that race. And then Congressman Seth Moulton, who was sort of the original insurgent primary challenger in Massachusetts in 2014 when he ran against Congressman John Tierney. He faces a couple primary challenges of his own. One phenomenon that's a little bit more typical of Massachusetts politics is the crowded race to replace Kennedy in the House. And because House seats open up so infrequently and before primaries were so uncommon in Massachusetts, that it's usual to see a huge group of Democrats jump into the primary. And so that's something I'm keeping my eye on. There are 8 people running just in the Democratic primary in that race. And so I'm interested in how mail-in voting is going to play in all of these contests across the state. It's something that you can kind of see as a test drive for mail-in voting in the presidential election in November, but it also may mean that we will not know the winner of any of these primaries, or at least some of them, on September 1st, on the day of the state primary election, if there's a hiccup with the mail-in ballots, or perhaps someone calls for a recount. And I'll leave you on this note, going back to my first point about how tumultuous the election cycle is going to be this year. The polling that UMass did indicates that it's clear that Democrats are looking to avoid the shock that they felt in 2016 when Hillary Clinton's victory felt like a given. And it seems like Massachusetts voters have largely made up their minds for the November election. Only 5% of respondents to the poll said that they were undecided. 61% plan to vote for Biden, and 28% plan to vote for Trump. And an overwhelming number of respondents said the nation is on the wrong track, 75%. So it appears, even though these big divisions in the state, in the Democratic primary, once we make it to November, everybody will be on the same page for the most part in Massachusetts. And on that note, I will turn it back to Jennifer. I look forward to your questions, and I'm sorry that I was muted for the first couple of minutes. Thanks for bearing with me.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And now I'll introduce our third panelist, who is Jesse Rhodes, Chair and Professor of Political Science and the Associate Director of UMass Poll.
Thanks so much, Jen. I want to thank both you and John for organizing this great panel, and also thank everyone for attending. I think both Tatishe and Stephanie have done a great job talking about the races that are underway, both the primary races in Massachusetts and the national races that we'll be seeing in the fall. I want to shift things a little bit and talk about the politics of the pandemic and how that's been playing out within the state. So let me share my screen with you. So in our most recent survey, we surveyed the respondents in the poll about their attitudes and experiences in relation to the pandemic, as well as some related issues. And I want to just highlight some important themes that have come through that are really interesting, and I think tell us a lot about what's going on in the politics and economics within the state right now. So I think, as Stephanie mentioned, and as we show, the pandemic is very much at the center of Massachusetts voters' thinking. When we look at the word clouds, which just ask the participants in the poll to list their most important or most salient topic, the coronavirus really rose to the top among issues. And you can also see that many of the other main issues, housing, jobs, unemployment, economy, and so forth, are very much intertwined with the pandemic. And so perhaps not surprisingly, the pandemic really is a primary, if not the primary issue on the minds of Massachusetts voters right now. And what we've seen is that it's not just affecting their lives right now, but it's affecting how they're thinking about the future within the state. So we asked the participants in the survey a number of things about how the pandemic was affecting their lives, whether they or their friends and family had tested positive for coronavirus, whether they'd recently have a job loss, they're primarily working from home, reducing hours at work because of childcare, fear of losing their job, worry about a second wave of the virus, and worry about school and daycares remaining closed. And what we've seen is that in the state, although we've been fortunate and had, at least since the summer, relatively small numbers of new cases, Massachusetts voters are very much affected. More than 25% say that they or someone that they know closely has been infected by COVID-19. More than a third say that they're primarily working from home. Almost 20% say that they fear losing their job. But really strikingly, we see anxiety about the future in relation to the pandemic. Almost 80% said that they are worried about a second wave of the virus. And more than 40% also said that they were worried about schools and daycares remaining closed. And so clearly this is something that the people that we surveyed view is something that's durable, something that they anticipate affecting them, not just in the short term, but for some time to come. So one thing that is really important to keep in mind in thinking about the politics of the pandemic in the state is that, and as I mentioned, this is a state that experienced a very early surge in new coronavirus cases, and we saw that very much in April and May. And then a real fall off in the number of new cases, and perhaps most importantly, while other states throughout the country experienced a surge of cases in July and August, new cases in Massachusetts have remained relatively stable and low since that time. And so that's relatively good news. In comparison with many states, Massachusetts is in a relatively good position. And so one question that came to mind is, why is that the case? What is it about Massachusetts? And we asked a number of questions in the survey that allowed us to get at this in some way. So we asked a number of questions about what Massachusetts voters in our poll are doing, and what efforts they're taking to mitigate transmission of COVID-19. And so we asked them, did you wear a face mask? Do you wear a face mask when you leave home? Do you keep at least 6 feet of distance from others? Do you avoid groups of 10 or more? And do you wash your hands for 20 seconds, after you return home? And so obviously these are all best practices in efforts to try to reduce the spread of COVID. And something that we found was very striking was that there appears to be very high levels of compliance across the board in terms of maintaining best practices. And so we think that this is interesting and important because it suggests that part of the story for the low transmission rate or the low new case rate over the last several months is that Massachusetts residents are really doing a good job on the whole of maintaining best practices to try to reduce the transmission of the virus. Because of the relative success, and I say, of course, relative success, we've seen the state move slowly toward reopening. And so we asked a number of questions related to phase 3 activities. So activities that were permitted due to improvement in the state's position. And we found that although a large number of activities are being permitted, with a few exceptions, Massachusetts, those who were surveyed in our poll, are not doing them, which is really striking. So although, reasonable share of the public are dining outdoor restaurants or visiting a salon or barbershop, but still less than majority. These other opportunities which are now available, Massachusetts residents are not undertaking them. They're not visiting aquariums, they're not going to the gym, they're not sending their kids to camp and so forth. Now, one thing that was interesting that we found in the survey is that the attitudes that are expressed do seem to be affected by national politics. So if we ask, if we break down attitudes and findings about COVID by party ID, or pardon me, by ideology, we find differences. And of course, there shouldn't be differences, right? So the virus doesn't affect people based on their ideology, but it does affect, ideology affects how people think about these issues. And we did find that liberals and conservatives responded in different ways to some of these questions. So the degree of worry about a second wave of the virus varied depending on your ideology. Your concern about schools and daycares remaining closed varied pretty significantly based on ideology in the other direction. And so we take from this that national politics affect how people are responding to some of these questions. So one of the really big political winners from the coronavirus pandemic, insofar as there can be winners, is Charlie Baker. And we found in the survey that Baker receives very high marks for his management and leadership during the coronavirus pandemic. He is viewed as the primary person who is responsible for the state's progress in managing COVID-19. And the word clouds indicate very strong and positive views of his management. And of course, perhaps surprisingly, even though Massachusetts residents view the nation as overwhelmingly on the wrong track, they have a much more positive view of the state. And again, I think this is suggestive of the perception that compared to many states throughout the country, Massachusetts is faring relatively well in the context of the pandemic. So one thing that we found that was very striking is that even as COVID-19 dominates the national agenda, Massachusetts registered voters still support Black Lives Matter, and they view it very, very favorably. So we found that a strong majority of those in our survey had positive attitudes towards the Black Lives Matter movement, that they were very aware of racial inequalities in American society. They overwhelmingly acknowledge that white people have advantages because of their skin color. And they also were very much aware that racial problems are not a rare and isolated situation. And so we strikingly found that there's pretty strong enthusiasm among those that we surveyed for large parts of the BLM agenda, in particular efforts to reform police in ways that reduce biases in policing and give those who are affected by police violence opportunities to sue and to protect themselves. And so what we took for this is that Massachusetts residents, although the pandemic is overwhelming most issues right now, there still is very widespread awareness of the importance of the politics of racial justice in this country, and there's a great deal of support among those that we surveyed. Thank you.
Thanks so much to the three panelists for your remarks, sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. And now we'll be going on to the Q&A phase of this webinar. We received a number of questions, both those that were sent in advance of the event and also those that are coming in now as we speak. We'll start first with some of the questions that came in first, and then move on to those that have currently come in. I'll be directing a question at each panelist specifically, but I also encourage the other panelists to chime in and follow up in a conversation. And just, I'll be looking for your hand and the participant to know that, the participant box to know that you're ready to talk. Okay, so this question I'm going to direct at you, Tatishe, and it asks, do your poll results now include predictions of how the Electoral College will go? And to combine that also with one that just came in, similarly, how do you vet the reliability of these polls in the current environment?
Thanks, those are really great questions. In terms of the Electoral College, our poll is really just focused on the Commonwealth. So, you know, with pretty strong certainty, I could say that Joe Biden's gonna win the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. My understanding of statewide polls around the country show some surprising results. There are, you know, discussions that states like Texas might be up for grabs, which of course is a necessary state to the Republican coalition and ability to win the Electoral College. So if Texas, as a result of demographic change, I think as a result of their issues regarding the coronavirus pandemic, is leaning towards the Democratic Party. I think that is going to really upset our understandings of the Electoral College and, of course, do damage to President Trump's reelection bid. In terms of the reliability of the polls, it's a great question. I always say polls are really a snapshot. They're a snapshot of where voters are at that moment in time. And so I think, speaking about our poll, we were polling in July and August, and it, as we said, surprisingly showed that Markey was up. And I think the best way to check the reliability of polls, if you really care about the predictive aspects of polls, which, you know, a lot of people do, is to check alongside other polls. And so we've known since our poll had dropped that Suffolk, as well as UMass Lowell, have also shown Markey up by between, I think, 8 and 12 points. And so looking at the reliability of that particular result, I think the more surveys find a similar finding, I think the more it's clear that this isn't necessarily a dead heat race, but something a little bit more like a Markey victory, a clear Markey victory. But we will see in 6 days.
Stephanie, you've written quite a bit on mail-in voting, so I'm going to direct this question at you. And that is, how could we use this mail-in voting debate and the reforms that might come out of it to address racial inequities and access to the ballot?
I think that's a great question, and it's going to be hard to know how mail-in voting works, at least in Massachusetts, until we go through a cycle of it. So the legislature, the state government passed a mail-in voting rule at the beginning of the summer. I think it was around June, and then started to implement the program in July and August. I believe today was actually the final day to request a mail-in ballot. And from what the Secretary of State has told us, and from what I've heard from town and city clerks anecdotally, turnout is way up. Over 1 million people have requested mail-in ballots this year, which would put us on track, I believe, to have the highest primary turnout since maybe 2006. If everybody gets those ballot applications in the mail, fills out the ballots, and then mails them back in time for them to count ballots. Mail-in ballots are due to town and city clerks by 8 o'clock on September 1st. In some other states, and somebody tried to petition the state this year here in Massachusetts to have those ballots count after September 1st, as long as they were postmarked by that date. But the Supreme Judicial Court struck that down today. So, I mean, it seems like in an ideal world that expanded mail-in balloting will help to address kind of ballot access if those programs are implemented the right way. And so what I'll be watching for on September 1st is to see if the education around mail-in balloting and mail-in voting worked to kind of turn people out in different communities that normally vote. But I think that's a great question, and we have to kind of wait and see.
Thanks, Stephanie. Here's a question about polling and its impacts, and I'll direct this to, Tatishe, you have your hand up. Sorry about that. Please.
No worries, no worries. I just want to share, we actually asked a question about how people are planning to vote in this upcoming election. So let me see if I can share that with you. Can I? There we go. And I'll be real quick. I promise. So what you can see here is that the overwhelming majority of Democratic likely voters, at least, are going to vote by mail. And this, of course, decreases the costs associated with turning out to vote. And I think that's why you're seeing such a wellspring of interest in this race and just interest in voting. You don't have to find out where your polling place is. You don't have to make time in your day to go to vote. You don't have to wait in line. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting experience, or experiment at least, to see how turnout can be increased, particularly amongst groups that historically have had low levels of turnout.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, to direct this question at Jesse, it is, if the public misunderstands polling, does it harm political efforts and activities? And if so, is polling worth it?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think, there's a couple of ways of thinking about that question. For the most part, I think that the public can understand polls perfectly well, so long as those who produce polls and those who report them accurately, and also report them within their context and with their strengths as well as their limitations. So one of the most important things to keep in mind about any survey is that it's a snapshot that represents the public at the time that a survey is being fielded. And it may have predictive ability, but there's no guarantee. And certainly no single poll can bear the weight of predicting an outcome or determining an outcome. I think the broader point that I would make as a social scientist is that polling can be, and I think a lot of what Tatishe and I do, and many of us do, is not just kind of public opinion polling for horse races or for particular surveys, but we try to use survey research in order to understand phenomena in politics more broadly. And this can be incredibly empowering. So you can use survey research to understand why some people vote and why other people don't vote. When you understand that, then you can help contribute to conversations and design interventions to increase access to voting. If you understand why different groups feel disempowered in the political system, which is something that you can gain access to via surveying people, then that gives you real empirical information to contribute to conversations about how to empower people. And so I think when we talk about polling, we think about horse races and just kind of who's up and who's down in this particular race or this particular election cycle. But the real value of survey research is in combining that kind of polling with broader survey efforts to understand how the public thinks and why the public behaves the way that it does, so that you can contribute to broader debates and you can actually help design policies and programs and initiatives to help empower people, particularly people who may not be as visible because they're not as politically active or they don't have as much political power.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to go to the Q&A here and start asking some of these questions. This comes from an audience member, Mark Swartz, who writes, rewriting an earlier question, do you think there will be any further reopening in Massachusetts before a vaccine comes?
So I can take an initial stab at that. I think that the really key question is not just whether there's a vaccine, but what the rate of new cases is in the state and the ratio of cases to tests. We have no idea when there will be a vaccine. Creating vaccines are very difficult. I think many people have a hope that there will be a vaccine as early as this spring, but there's no guarantee. That would be the fastest vaccine creation in history. And I think a much more important set of factors is what's the new case rate and what's the ratio of cases to tests. Because if those rates are low, then you can make a reasonable case for continued reopening, because it's about the relationship between risk and costs. That we all know that there are huge costs to remaining relatively closed. Those costs are going to compile over time. And so if the actual rates are low, I think that you will see a lot of understandable political pressure for further reopening, even if there's not a vaccine. And you can make the argument also, as long as there's a lot of testing and there's good contact tracing, which are ifs, that is it's an ethical way to proceed.
Okay, going up the Q&A questions here. We have a number of themes that are converging. So we had a previous question that was sent in that said on local elections, which said, what makes Kennedy and Morse difficult opponents for Markey and Neal? And inversely, what makes these incumbents tough to beat? And then along those lines, David Florine wrote, and do any of the panelists have insight on why progressives seem to ignore the real value that leading and generally progressive incumbent congressmen provide to Massachusetts? We seem to shoot ourselves just when we can gain real benefits to the state. And this is open to any panelist who wants to take it on.
What's really interesting about Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Richard Neal is that they have a lot in common. The primary races that they're facing have kind of cast them on two different sides of the party, or two different wings of the party, and they're using very different coalitions to try to win re-election. But when you look at their political history, they're not all that different. They're almost the exact same age. They both have sort of these working class roots. Markey grew up in Malden, which I'm sure you've seen on his commercials. He makes you pretty aware. And Congressman Neal grew up in Springfield. They both were elected to office when they were relatively young, and they served together in the House, I think, for over 2 decades. So it's interesting how these two people, and actually Neal took over as the dean of the congressional delegation when Markey was elected to the Senate in 2013. So in some ways they've had similar paths, although they've converged. And now it's become more clear than ever in this election. But, you know, some of Markey's votes in the past weren't as progressive as his positions are now when it comes to the 1994 crime bill or the war in Iraq or a few other things that Congressman Kennedy often brings up in their debates. And so it's fascinating to me just kind of the different coalitions that they've been able to put together when you have two politicians who have pretty much very interesting and similar backgrounds. When it comes to why they're facing primaries and perhaps Massachusetts shooting itself in the foot for knocking out a powerful incumbent, I think that's just where the energy is in the party right now. It's with the progressive wing, especially after victories in 2018. But on the other side, Joe Biden won Massachusetts on Super Tuesday. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders finished behind him. So I think the big question is whether Massachusetts voters are going to kind of track with the way that they voted on Super Tuesday, going for kind of the more moderate option, or if they're going to embrace the progressive wing like these challengers are hoping.
Yeah, to sort of double down on that point, I think a lot of young Democratic elected officials and potential candidates saw what happened in 2018 with Presley. So Presley was able to mount an insurgent campaign against a longstanding Democratic powerhouse in Capuano and defeat him. And I think it opened the eyes of a number of Gen X and millennial elected officials who no longer will simply wait until it's their turn and are wanting to pressure these incumbents who have been there for decades. I mean, Markey has been in Congress longer than I've been alive. And so the idea that, and I think you're seeing this across society, is that, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, whatever you want to say, are putting pressure on older generations and are wanting to step into these positions of power and influence because, of course, they want to direct their own future and the future of their kids and their friends and their families. So I think, as Stephanie said, this is also reflective of just larger pressures in the Democratic Party. And we saw a little bit of this with our own Seth Moulton in 2018. He put pressure on Nancy Pelosi. She was able to beat that back. But I really do think this is one of those instances, again, in which people are no longer willing to play by the norms of politics. And we're seeing this in primaries. We're seeing it in the Republican National Convention as well, that the norms that we're used to are being broken, either for the good or for the bad, but that's what's happening.
If I could just make one more point on this before we move on, because you really got me thinking about Ayanna Pressley in 2018. And I think not the mistake, but perhaps the miscalculation that some candidates made after seeing her victory was that progressive change and generational change were the same thing when they're not. And I think that there was, and it happened across the country, but in Congressman Neal's district in particular, it's whiter and it's older than the district that Presley won in. And that district had seen a lot more change, and it has a younger electorate and a majority-minority electorate. And so I think that's part of the challenge that's facing Holyoke Mayor Alex Morrison trying to unseat Neal there. Even though the dynamics are similar in some ways, the electorate is much different.
Another question that was sent in by a couple of the audience members was this one, and I open it to any of the panelists. What are your thoughts on laws that restrict ex-felons from voting? should all barriers to voting be removed? And I think we saw on Jesse's slide some of the ways in which Massachusetts residents respond to that, but people are interested in what the panelists think around this issue.
Sure, so I can speak a little to that. So we know that incarceration rates vary by demographic groups. They're not racially neutral. They tend to entrench racial inequalities. And when there are barriers to voting on the basis of incarceration status or felon status, that too is going to reinforce, in particular, racial inequalities. And so there's very good research by Chris Eugen and others indicating, in 2016, there were 6 million fewer people who were able to vote than otherwise would have been eligible due to felon disenfranchisement. And there is some evidence that in some states, felon disenfranchisement can make the difference in elections in states that are tight because of the nature of who bears the disproportionate burden of felon disenfranchisement. We do have examples of states that have no penalty. People can vote while they're incarcerated, right? So in Maine, that's possible. In Vermont, that's possible. Those states, have not descended into chaos. And I think that the actual proves the possible here. And so, personally, I'm strongly in favor of removal of all barriers to voting without regard to incarceration status, because, first of all, when someone receives a punishment for committing a crime, the incarceration, that's supposed to be the punishment. In a modern period, particularly when there are racially disparate consequences based on our penal system, we don't want to further disenfranchise and further punish people and limit the political power of groups by prohibiting them or limiting their ability to participate in politics.
Sorry, so I will jump in again with some data from our poll, because this is clearly one of the interests that Jesse and myself and Ray and Alex have. In fact, Jesse has written a number of books on racial inequalities, but in particular, racial inequalities as it pertains to the right to vote. And so we asked Massachusetts residents about a lot of relatively progressive changes to the ways in which we go about voting. And what we saw across the board, and with some surprises, is that that residents and voters in particular are really supportive of this question of allowing felons to vote. So I'll share my screen one more time and show you these results. So when we asked, we'll start down here, automatic registration, again, 63% are in favor, and this is all Massachusetts residents. So this includes Republicans and conservatives. It's not just likely voters. Making Election Day a national holiday, again, decreasing the costs associated with turning out to vote. A lot of people can't vote because they have to work. So 68% of residents support that. Conducting all elections by mail, even though there's been a lot of discussions about the negatives associated with that, we still have a majority here. And then in terms of the questions about allowing people convicted of felonies to vote after serving their sentence, which I believe is true in Massachusetts, 71%. So almost 3/4 of all voters are supportive of doing this. What was really shocking was the question regarding the requirement that voters should show government-issued photo IDs. This has become a partisan issue. This has become an ideological issue with conservatives and Republicans supporting the showing of government-issued photo ID. And we see an overwhelming majority of the state's residents support that as well. So just to put this in context as it pertains to Massachusetts.
Now I want to turn to some questions that are converging together. So we received a previous written question asking about the 40% of the population who support Trump. One of the written questions that came in was who comprises this 40%? And I see another one here from Trisha on the Q&A right now that says, do you have any insight into what motivates the tenacious 40% of the US population to support Trump regardless of his actions? And this is to any panelist who chooses to answer the question.
I nominate Jesse to answer this question.
Well, I can certainly take a stab at it. I mean, I think it's really important in thinking about why people vote the way they do, why they have attitudes the way they do, that you have to start with partisan identification. That if you want to answer the question, who votes for Donald Trump, the main answer is Republicans. He is a Republican presidential nominee. He is the face of the party. And so people who have identified as Republicans, for whom Republicanism is a central part of their identity, they're going to tend to stick with the primary representative of that identity. And so it's also very important that once you have something as powerful as partisanship as your identity, and it is important, political scientists and sociologists and those in related disciplines have really shown that partisanship is and has become an identity similar to your religion or your race, or kind of where you live in the country. It's very similar. It's really core to your identity. Once you have that as part of your identity, the way that you think about information and the way that you think about news is influenced. So Democrats and Republicans think about the information they receive differently. If Democrats hear information about Donald Trump not telling the truth or breaking the law or doing things that are unsavory, that really sticks with them, and it reinforces their prior beliefs that he's a terrible person and I don't want to vote for him and I don't like him. For Republicans, it's the opposite, right? And that's because identity acts to bring in and reinforce information that reconfirms that identity and deflect and lead people to ignore information that does not confirm or is dissonant with that identity. Now, to be clear, that's not just a knock on Republicans. Democrats behave the exact same way. So when Democrats hear negative things about Joe Biden, right? So there have been credible accusations that Joe Biden has engaged in sexual assault, for example. For Democrats, they take that much less seriously than do Republicans. It tends to bounce off. And again, that is reflective of the influence of identity on people's tendency to accept or reject information, and also to seek out information as well.
I'm going to pull one last question because I think it's a pretty quick takeaway for the end of the panel that was entered in the Q&A. And the question is, all the media seems biased one way or the other. Is there any outlet that anyone recommends?
I recommend that you read Stephanie's daily article in Politico if you really want to be up on Massachusetts politics. And I'm actually being serious here. She presents a really, unideological, nonpartisan overview of the nature of politics, and then also provides you with links to various articles, whether that be in the Globe or the Herald or any local papers, which really keeps folks who want to be in the know in the know. So I would definitely recommend, if you care about Massachusetts politics, with your coffee, with your breakfast of choice, to check out Stephanie's articles.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you all to the panelists. I want to thank Tatishe and Stephanie and Jesse for your expert observations and for taking time to share with us today. Thank you, Jen, for moderating this event. And of course, thank you to all our participants for tuning in. And thanks as well to the people behind the scenes that make all of this look easy. And trust me, it isn't. Salo DePaula, Sally Fitz, Stephanie Subak. I hope you can all join us for future events on this and other important topics. Take good care, stay well, and vote. Thank you, and have a good evening.